He was 5 minutes from the boardroom, his phone buzzing like an impatient fly, when the small voice stopped him. "Sir, I'm the new owner." Richard Hale glanced down before he registered the words. A boy, no more than 7, sat cross-legged on the strip of cracked pavement beneath a blue tarp. He held a greasy paper parcel close, like a treasure. The oily scent of fried dough rose and braided with the sulfur of hot asphalt. The child wore a too-big jacket and a grin that seemed to have been stitched from defiance and hope. Richard laughed without thinking, an easy, reflexive sound meant to clear the sudden absurdity of the interruption. Executives did not get surprised by children in parking lots. Executives did not get claimed as property by anyone's imagination. He checked his watch, tucked a company ID into the corner of his briefcase, and prepared to step around the boy to his black SUV. The boy's small hand slipped under the car's rim and came up with a dirty napkin. He unfolded it with the care of someone honoring a relic. From inside, he produced a half-eaten pastry, its crust still crisp at the edge. He thrust it toward Richard. "Found the rest," he said. "You can have half." For a man who could buy entire blocks of the city with the spare change in his pocket, for a man who had learned that speed and firmness closed doors others couldn't see, the offer landed like an unexpected rainstorm. Richard looked at the pastry, at the child's palms nicked and calloused from living in a world that doesn't spare kids, and then at the boy's face, so small under the tarp, so earnest. He accepted the paper-wrapped half because it was easier than saying no. He sat on the curb and broke the pastry in two, the steam hissing between his fingers. The child watched him with the concentration of someone observing strange new behavior. When Richard bit into the pastry, the savory smell washed something raw loose behind his ribs. His mother's kitchen for a moment, the hush of Sunday mornings, a memory he had kept in a drawer and rarely opened. They ate in companionable silence. The city hummed around them, a distant tide, horns, shoes on concrete, the faint thrum of air conditioning units. The boy's name, when Richard finally asked, came out like an extra afterthought. "Noah," he said. "My grandma says I have to be careful with introductions." "And your grandmother?" "Rosa." He pointed toward the tarp with a small protective gesture. "She makes the best fried things on this side of the bridge." Richard swallowed. "You live here?" Noah's eyes narrowed, as if the question itself needed to be folded gently. "We stay here," he corrected. "We don't stay in a lot, but we're fine." There was pride in that little correction, not pride in hardship, but in the kind of resilience that had taught a child how to keep dignity when the world offered none. Richard felt for the first time that week the strange loosening of a knot he had lived with for years.
He was late, but he stayed a minute more to ask where they got the oil for frying, to admire a dog-eared picture book Noah had tucked beside him, to notice how deftly the boy folded the paper and hid the crumbs for later. "Sir," Noah said then, serious as a judge, "look under the car." Richard crouched, thinking of security sensors and city fines. He lifted the plastic wheel guard and peered into the shadows. There, tucked between a dent and the chassis, sat a small, flattened box. When he reached for it, a scrap of paper slid out and fluttered on the pavement like a small, tired bird. On it, in a child's hurried scrawl, was a single word: Hale. The name pierced him with the faint, disorienting clarity of a bell. Hale, his own name, written on a scrap of a life miles away from polished boardrooms and glass facades. He handed it back without comment. Overhead, a delivery truck rolled past, and the sound erased whatever impulse he had to make a big scene. "Sir, I'm the new owner," Noah repeated, as if rehearsing a punchline. He laughed then, bright and quick. Richard laughed back, out of politeness, out of the ridiculousness of a boy declaring ownership of the corporate air, and because, for a moment, it bought him space to breathe. He rose to leave and promised a small thing he did not know, yet he could not withdraw. "Tomorrow, I'll bring you a blanket." That was the kind of promise men like Richard made, a slip of goodwill that most of the world would forget by morning. But when the boy's grin broadened and he tucked the paper with his name into his pocket, Richard felt the first genuine tug of responsibility since the day his father's face blurred in a photograph and conversation stopped between them. If you want more stories like this, like and subscribe. The boardroom was all glass and angles. Mark Sinclair had already taken the window seat and was tapping a pen like a metronome. He wore power carefully, the way surgeons wear gloves. Richard, for the duration of the first few slides, found himself distracted by the smell on his fingers, starch and oil, and by the paper scrap sliding in and out of the front pocket of his suit jacket as if it had wings. "Everything all right?" Mark asked at the second break, the corner of his mouth softening with the right measure of concern. Richard told him a half-truth about an odd interruption in the lot. Mark, who had risen with the company and who had not climbed alone, shrugged and told him there was no room for distractions. "We have investors looking at margins next quarter, Richard. Focus." After the meeting, Richard wandered through his office like a man walking past rooms in a house he used to live in. His desk, clean, ordered, an altar of appointments, held the invisible fossil of a life where relationships had been transactions and kindnesses were judging stones. He kept the scrap of paper folded into his wallet.
At some point, the image of a small bakery awoke in him, a storefront awash in wheat flour, an old sign with the word Hale stenciled in flicking paint. He had not thought of the bakery in years. It belonged to a time before his father taught him to buy companies instead of making bread. He found himself, without planning it, back under the skyline a little later that afternoon, a wool blanket rolled in the trunk. He had ordered it with the same efficiency he used for mergers. Click, confirm, deliver. He wrapped it again, not in tissue, but in a brown paper bag, because Noah had wrapped his pastry that way and because it felt right. The underpass smelled of oil and the damp of the river. A line of people sat along the curb, some with shopping carts turned into rooms, others with plastic tubs for their few keepsakes. Rose's tarp was a bright sliver amid the gray, a small domestic theater where a single pot bubbled and spat. When Richard set the blanket in front of the boy, Noah's eyes widened as if he had just seen the moon drop from the sky. "You promised," the boy said, solemn as treaty terms. "I did," Richard said. "I didn't know if I would make it. You did." They sat together, and Richard spoke of nothing important, traffic, the color of the city this season, while Rosa offered him tea out of a chipped enamel mug, steam carrying the scent of cinnamon and something more, caring, made visible in the way she ladled the broth into mismatched cups. She had eyes that read the world with the slow patience of someone who had watched storms and yet learned how to arrange doors against them. She told him, in a voice that was at once proud and wary, how they had come to the underpass, how a landlord had raised rent on the room they had once shared, how her son had found work 2 towns over and shipped back nothing but promises. Her sentences were short, made of economy and necessity. Richard listened. He handed her a card without intending to, a simple executive card from his wallet. Rose's hands took it as if it were a bill. She folded it and put it into the seam of her tarp. Later, she would tell Noah not to throw anything away, a lesson learned by people who could not afford to be careless. Noah had a habit of reading aloud when he thought no one was listening. He read the labels on cans like poetry, bound and bowing the names into the lining of his head. When Richard asked whether Noah went to school, the child shrugged. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes there's room, and if not, I read anyway." It struck Richard that the child's grammar made responsibility sound like a game of chance. He had grown used to measuring worth in quarterly gains. To hear it evaporate from the lips of a boy and be replaced by this generous acceptance felt like the first breach in a dam. Over the next week, Richard's after-hours were no longer always dark. He drove by the underpass before dawn, left a bag of clothes in the hollow of a tree, found his way back at dusk to sit on a stoop and listen to stories. He learned the routes of the city's overlooked corners in the half-light when office towers were still dreaming in glass. He brought books, not the glossy business tomes he usually consumed, but picture books with big letters and long windows of wonder. Noah devoured them, his little finger following sentences like a pilgrim's map. Pieces of their life fit together in small, quiet ways. Noah taught Richard the makeshift games of the underpass children, how to fashion a ball out of old fabric, how to balance a spoon for hours so time could be passed as skill. Rosa taught Richard to knead dough in a way that quieted his hands. Under her guidance, his fingers learned again how to press and give and feel the texture of something rising, of promise becoming something more than a concept. Richard told no one at the office, or he told only the pieces he thought safe. He told Mark that he'd been giving small donations to a shelter. He told Sylvia in HR, when she asked about community ventures, that he was thinking about a modest pilot program to offer day jobs to people resettling from unstable housing. Sylvia, with her patient competence, drew diagrams and timelines and the kind of practical translation that comforted men who feared improvisation. "Start small," she said. "We can create a transitional stipend, a mentorship pairing, a part-time role. Give us parameters and we'll handle the logistics." Mark objected, politely but firmly.
Corporate responsibility is one thing, he told Richard over late-night coffee, but we cannot let sentiment shape strategy. We serve stakeholders. Our margin is what keeps our people employed. Richard found himself unable to recite those lines with the same conviction as before. When Mark spoke of optics, Richard saw the child with a scrap that said Hale, the boy's thumb stained with flour from Rosa's kitchen. He thought of the tart, bright laugh the boy had when he called himself the new owner. He thought, with a stun that felt like truth, about how easily he could turn his attention into action and what the ripples of that might be. And there were small, inexplicable details that nagged him: the scrap with his name, a photograph Noah kept tucked under a stone, the picture of a storefront with flaking paint, and the word Hale half legible above the window. Once, Noah had hummed a lullaby Richard had not heard since his mother fell ill, a melody that lived in corners of his memory he had walled off. These were tiny things, coincidences that could be folded into the comfortable box of nothing, or they could be the first measures of something more complicated. Richard told himself he would do the sensible thing. He would set up the pilot with Sylvia. He would deposit a meeting on Mark's calendar, a brief, bullet-pointed plan that addressed liability, background checks, time frames. He would protect the company from unpredictability while extending the reach of its resources. But there was a moment, one rain-silver morning, when he found Noah polishing a small tin lunchbox under the tarp and peering at its lid with a concentration that seemed almost like prayer. When Richard bent to see, his breath hitched. Faintly stamped on the metal, under layers of grime, were letters H-A-L-E. They were not crisp. The stamp had been crushed by someone who used the box until the curves of the letters were almost gone. Someone had kept that lunchbox like an heirloom. Someone had known the name long enough to make it part of their daily life. "You find things?" Richard asked, sounding like a child himself. Noah looked up, the light catching on his eyes. "People leave things," he said. "I keep the ones we need." Rosa, watching from the pot, called out, "You keep that out of the rain. It belongs with the others." Richard took the tin gently and felt for a heartbeat, as if he were touching a relic of himself. He could have had it polished, framed, the metal returned to the gleam of his childhood memory. Instead, he handed it back to Noah. "You hold on to that," he said. "It's yours." Noah nodded, solemn as a bishop. That afternoon, Richard sat at his desk and opened a file he had not visited in years, a box of scanned documents his father had left in the company attic. He meant to be cautious, to only skim. Instead, he found a ledger entry from a time before acquisitions, before leverage buyouts, before the company outgrew the people who had built it. In the margins, in a cramped hand, was a notation: Hale and Sons, loan to Rosa Valdez for bakery repairs, IOU, signed by Thomas Hale. He felt the room tilt for a second. Thomas Hale. The name was older still, his grandfather's, folded into the family litany like an old hymn. A loan to a woman named Rosa. He knew the surname. The mind, which had been trained for numbers and negotiation, moved to a swift inference, a past connection, a small kindness made decades ago and paid forward by the simple survival of a name. It could be nothing more than a bookkeeping quirk. It could be the breadcrumb that led toward a story he was not ready to hear. He made a call to a clerk in the records department, then to a county archive, then to a woman in a warehouse who typed the faint script into a database and returned with a scanned photograph. The image offered more questions than answers. An old storefront, a faded HALE above the window, and a woman, young, determined, standing on the stoop. She held in her hands a child no bigger than Noah looked now. The corner of the photograph had been nicked, but in the dust someone had written, in small hand, Rosa, 1912.
Richard found himself walking back across the city and to the underpass in a state of private, churning calculation. He had not made the connections explicit, had not yet allowed himself to draw the line between the ledger and the lunchbox, but the senseless, tender way the universe had folded his name into the underpass pressed on him as if asking for attention. He did not tell Noah about ledgers or photographs. He did not speak about the possibility of more than coincidence. He bought a second blanket and left it folded on a bench by the tarp, along with a packet of crayons and a set of small notebooks.
Noah's face lit as if he had been given light in the middle of winter. Rosa, who had envisioned men only in terms of what they could bring, met Richard's gaze with an appraisal that refused both charity and gratitude. What she wanted, it seemed, was dignity. "Do not make promises you can't keep," she told him once, the admonition like a recipe, measured, essential. "People learn to count on you. Do not be the kind of man who vanishes." He held that line in his head, and that night called Sylvia to sketch out a plan. "Start small," she said again, which began to feel like an incantation. "Document processes, offer flexibility, work with the shelters and local schools. Make the pilot about skill building, not charity." Mark would argue the optics. Investors would ask about risk. Richard thought of that childish proclamation, "Sir, I'm the new owner," replayed in his mind like a motif. Ownership, he was beginning to suspect, would not be about deeds and titles. He had built infrastructures of ownership, stock options, executive perks, corner offices. He had not built the muscle of being owned by something else, by a promise, by a responsibility that belonged to him just because his name happened to be, absurdly, written on a scrap of paper in a child's pocket. The first resistance came gentle and fast. Mark called him into a glassed conference room and slid a sheaf of market analyses across the table. "Philanthropy has its place," Mark said. "Integration with personnel systems is complicated. Backgrounds are fraught. Our stakeholders will not accept an ad hoc program." Richard nodded, then found his voice in the quiet line between two breaths. "I am not asking for ad hoc," he said. "I'm asking for a pilot, a narrow path with measurable outcomes." Mark did what Mark always did when he did not have a moral argument. He fought pragmatics. "What do you expect from your people?" he asked. "Do you want our security team babysitting neighborhoods? We need policy. We need precedent. And we also need youth not to grow up thinking they don't belong," he said. His tone surprised him, soft with the exhaustion of late-night garage doors and the reality of someone whose hands had learned to make. "We're a company that moves goods. We move value. We can move the smallest hands towards something steadier." Mark's reply was calibrated.
"Then make it data-driven. Make it safe. Make it not about one man's conscience." Richard agreed and left the room with seeds of structure. He would bring in Sylvia's diagrams, propose a 6-week trial, specify mentorship, and control the narrative. He could transform impulse into policy. He could fix the edges so the center did not leak. What he did not yet own was how much his impulses had changed him. At the edge of the week, when rain had washed the city clean and left small mirror pools on the asphalt, Noah ran up to the car as Richard pulled into the lot. He had mud on his knees and bruises on his knuckles and a triumph on his face. "Sir," he said, and this time his voice carried the weight of something rehearsed and meant. He held up a folded sheet of paper like a certificate. "I talked to Mrs. Daniels at the community center. She said I can do a reading helper thing. I can help kids. I'll be busy after breakfast, then we'll be here, so I should say it again." Richard had already heard the words, had already felt the tilt of them. He smiled, indulgent, and reached for his keys. As he did, Noah slipped a small, dented object into his palm, the tin lunchbox, scrubbed and bright in the child's hands now, the word Hale visible under the sieve of time. "Sir, I'm the new owner," Noah said again, but this time his voice had a new inflection, an edge like a seed becoming wood. He pronounced it as if ownership could be a claim against the world, as if to name something was to begin the slow work of keeping it. Richard laughed, short, startled, unsure. He had a mind full of ledger entries and corporate bylaws and contingency plans. He had not planned on grief or on the odd, knotty path toward atonement that had found him starting with a blanket. He slid the tin into his jacket. Later, at his desk, he unfolded the paper scrap once more. Hale. He traced the letters with a finger that had been trained to measure and figure and assess. There would be a time for documents, for phone calls, for formalities. There would be a time to present a plan to the board, for Mark's cautions to become clean lines in a corporate presentation. But in that moment, leaning back in his chair with a child's lunchbox cool against his heart, Richard felt the shape of something else, a possibility that extended beyond quarterly reports, a network of small, accountable gestures that could become habit. He imagined a breakfast in the company cafeteria with steam and voice and laughter, where hooks were now only hung up in solitude. He imagined a mural painted on the blank concrete wall near the underpass, colors rising like a promise. He made one more private promise, to himself this time. He would not be the man who vanished.
And yet, as the city moved on, there was a small, persistent ache in the place where the past and the present met. That scrap with his name, the lunchbox, the ledger line, those were not coincidences he could ignore forever.
Someone had once written Hale and pressed it into a woman's hand. Someone had kept a record. Someone had named a transaction almost a century ago. He put the 10 into his desk drawer and shut it like closing a book with his finger on the margin. The drawer closed on the fragment of a life he did not quite own and did not yet understand. Outside the glass, the city carried on. Deliveries, lights, the small, efficient motion of commerce. He had a plan to create a narrow path, to make a pilot program, to keep the edges safe. He had the warmth of a child's laugh folded into his coat. He had 2 tiny clues that might be nothing, or might be the beginning of a story that had been waiting decades for somebody to notice it. He had, most of all, a promise he had already chosen to keep. When he left the office that night, he thought he had tucked the day safely into a pocket reserved for good intentions. He did not know then how very memorably a child's declaration could echo down corridors and shift the world's weight. He did not know whose hands would finally trace the softened imprint of Hale on the city's worn metal. He only knew he had been laughed at and he had laughed back, and that the laugh was the smallest, truest thing that had happened to him in a long time. He kept the 10 in his drawer longer than he meant to. It was small, dented, the letters H-A-L-E ghosted under grime, and sometimes at night Richard would open the drawer as if to test whether the past inside it could be coaxed into the present. More often than not, he found himself tracing the stamp with the pad of his thumb and feeling a tug that had nothing to do with legalities or ledgers. It was a tug that felt suspiciously like conscience. The pilot program began without fanfare. Sylvia drew up job descriptions that read less like charity postings and more like invitations. Kitchen assistant, inventory helper, reading buddy, facilities aide. The HR team took fingerprints and references and learned to phrase phrases around dignity. People in need became participants in company language. Nowhere in the paperwork did anyone reduce a life to a number. The first hires were cautious. A man who had once worked as a short-order cook showed up with a patchwork jacket and a grin that suggested he had been practicing politeness for years. A woman who folded shirts for a living took an afternoon shift in the mailroom and exhaled in a way Richard had not heard at the office in a long time. An exhale that came from the relief of a schedule that meant food could be counted on. Rosa agreed to a small, carefully considered arrangement. On Wednesdays, she would cook in the company cafeteria, a slot that Sylvia arranged to be called Community Wednesday, so no one would sit beneath the weight of charity. Employees could buy meals at cost, and the proceeds would help offset the transitional stipends. Rosa's pots were old but faithful. The cinnamon-scented broth she ladled into mismatched bowls carried the kind of comfort that made grown men close their eyes. The first Wednesday was quiet. A handful of employees had been nudged by emails that spoke to wellness and team cohesion. Mark had agreed to attend for 20 minutes and then leave, to signal support without making it a spectacle, he said. He lingered longer than his plan. He had not expected to notice how the stainless steel shine of the cafeteria softened next to a clay pot, under which steam rose like weather. Richard watched from a corner table as people took their first bites. He watched the front-line personnel, dispatch clerks, security guards, close their eyes and nod the way someone nods at a hymn. He watched Sylvia move through the room like someone shepherding a tentative hope. He watched Mark, hands tucked around a steaming bowl, whose jaw moved with a small personal reckoning. It was not that any of them were converted by soup. It was that the ritual of being fed by a neighbor stripped the distance between polished shoes and scuffed toes. Noah arrived as he always did, with mud on his knees, a grin wide enough to split the clouds. He stood at the edge of the cafeteria, looking at a room that belonged to a part of the city he had only visited in fragments. He did not intrude. He watched Rosa ladle from a pot like an artist at an easel. The sight lodged in Richard's chest with a stubborn patience. The pilot gathered momentum in the small arithmetic of days. Attendance at the cafe lunches crept up, and with it came a quiet ripple. Someone offered a used bus pass. Someone else taught a man how to repair a tire. A group in accounting started donating leftover office supplies. Sylvia's spreadsheets began to show measures that pleased the board: reduction in turnover in the pilot cohort, improved morale in the teams that volunteered as mentors, a modest but consistent uptick in employees using their paid volunteering hours. Mark said the word margin less often and the word community more.
He did not become sentimental overnight. He still made caution a profession, but he stopped cutting people off in mid-sentence. Where once his default reflex was to measure risk, he learned slowly and badly to square risk against the warmth of a bowl of soup and a child's laugh. Noah, for his part, became an unofficial fixture. He did not need the cafeteria to survive. Rosa had ways to stretch ingredients and a stubborn thrift that kept them fed. But the meals were a ritual that made him part of a room that had once seemed like a different species of life. He sat at the end of long tables and listened as men and women who spent their days in supply chains and balance sheets described in surprising detail the things they cared about when they were children: hobbies, fear of dogs, a first bike.
He gave opinions with the utter authority of someone who had watched too many adults choose silence over story. One late afternoon, while Sylvia was closing out an inventory log, a small knock at Richard's office door preceded a visit that would change the pilot's scope. It was Mrs. Daniels from the community center, age softened into something patient and bright, who had been Noah's first adult champion for reading. Her eyes took in his office the way sunlight takes in a window. "It's about the lunchbox," she said, without preamble. He had known there would come a conversation where the artifacts of the past would have to be explained, and he had not expected to feel like a child at the prospect. He ushered her to a chair and set a mug on the table because it seemed the civilized thing to do. Mrs. Daniels leaned forward, hands folded. "This town remembers things," she said. "It keeps them in jars sometimes. Sometimes those jars sit in attics, and someone takes them down, and they smell like dust and sugar, and they open like a mouth." She told him carefully how the center had been approached by an elderly volunteer who, while helping a neighbor clear estate papers, had found a stack of documents in a shoebox that mentioned a promissory note from Hale and Sons to a Rosa Valdez, dated decades ago. The volunteer had been practical in small town and had not known what to do with something that seemed to belong to someone they did not know. She had taken it to the center because they helped with forms and sometimes drove people to clerks' counters. Richard listened as if the world had moved in shallow, cautious water around him. The volunteer had brought the papers because no one else in the room fit the word Hale. But the volunteer had also been wise enough to notice names and dates. The note had been partially paid, partly outstanding, an odd bookkeeping gap that had never caused a lawsuit and had therefore slid into the legal equivalence of dust. Nobody had enforced it. Nobody had known to. Mrs. Daniels placed a folded copy on his desk. It was a promissory note, worn at the creases, the ink browned. It mentioned a loan and a modest interest, and the name Rosa Valdez as the borrower. It was stamped at the county clerk's office. On the back, in a later hand, was the notation that the note had, in effect, been converted to a small equity stake in the company when the bakery could not repay in cash during a period of economic hardship following a flood. The ledger was not explicit. It was an administrative footnote. It was the kind of archival accident that gets ignored in financial audits if no one is looking for it. Richard felt the room lurch with a logic he had not yet allowed himself to follow.
The pieces he had been carrying, the lunchbox, the ledger entry, Noah's humming, began to align with a cleanliness that frightened him. Perhaps Rosa's family had been granted a small share in the company decades ago, and somehow, through a twist of paperwork and the slow erosion of corporate memory, the asset remained unresolved. He did what men in his position tend to do. He called a lawyer. The lawyer was a practical woman with steady eyes who lived in a world of statutes and stamps. She asked questions that felt invasive and necessary: chain of title, transfer documents, statute of limitations, heirs. She requested the original documents and an exhaustive search of the company's old minute books and safe deposit records. She advised caution. There are equities, she said, but also complications. If there's a claim to be made, we should make it transparently. He had not expected to need permission to feel tremulous. He had spent a lifetime building companies and buying answers. This, he suddenly understood, would not yield to purchasing power alone. Law could confirm facts, but dignity required him to choose what to do with those facts. The search dug up more than he imagined. In an old file labeled for historical ledgers, tucked behind a brittle binder, a stock certificate clung to life. A small number of shares issued, in the language of the era, to Rosa Valdez, in consideration of bakery closure. The certificate had been unsigned in the modern sense, a relic from when paperwork could be settled with an ink blotted and trust.
There was a notary's mark and a county stamp. The legal team scratched through precedents and precedent and found that, while transfers had never been formalized, the company had, historically, honored such gestures when claims were made. It would not be fast. It would not make Noah or Rosa wealthy. The shares, by today's accounting, were a sliver, enough to buy a room in a decent neighborhood, but not a mansion. What it could do, the lawyer said cautiously, was be converted into a trust fund for Rosa and Noah, administered by the company and bound to specific uses: education, housing, and a community fund for the pilot program. It could also be accompanied by a public acknowledgement, a repair more symbolic than fiscal. Symbolic gestures can be powerful. They can also be noisome if mishandled. Richard felt the pull of both, wanting to right a wrong and fearing the spectacle that would reduce Rosa to a headline. He convened the facts quietly with Sylvia and found in her the pragmatic courage that had first made him trust her. "If we do this," she said, "we make it about agency. We make it about Rosa and Noah and what they want, not what we think they should get. Let's let them tell us what dignity looks like." They drafted a plan.
The company would recognize the historical paper and convert the equivalent into a restricted trust, a modest annual stipend for Rosa, a fund for Noah's education, and a designated capital sum to endow the program's expansion. They would offer Rosa the opportunity to partner with the cafeteria under a paid contractual arrangement, giving her autonomy over scheduling and menu. They would create a governance committee that included community members, so the program would not be a private whim, but a sustained initiative. If the legalities required paperwork and signatures, the human work required conversations and consent. Richard found that the hardest part was asking a woman who had been taught to count kindnesses as currency, whether she wanted a formal handout. Rosa's eyes hardened in an instant to a look that was both tender and resolute. "I don't want your charity as a crown," she said. "I want to step into my kitchen with my own coins in my pocket. I want my boy to think hunger is a visitor, not a housemate. If this can make a tray that feeds a child tomorrow, then I am willing to take responsibility for it." It was a response that made Richard's throat close. He had come to the underpass to give blankets. He had not expected to be offered a partnership. They announced the arrangement at a small gathering in the company's atrium, a room that usually held plaques and framed accolades, now set with mismatched chairs for neighbors and employees both. Richard spoke without notes. He told the story of a boy who had called him sir and a woman who had ladled soup. He read the phrasing that would convert old paper into an instrument of support and possibility. He did not make promises about miracles. He promised instead oversight, transparency, and a pledge that the company would become an institutional partner rather than a fleeting benefactor. When he finished, there was a pause like a held breath. Rosa stood. Her hands had stillness. "I don't want to be owned," she said, to both him and to the crowd. "We were never asking to be owned. But if a paper from long ago gives us a room and a chance for my Noah to sleep with a pillow, then let us take it and make it useful. Let us be owners of our morning." Noah clutched the lunchbox as if it were a standard. He stepped forward and, in a voice that no longer needed repair, said, "Sir, I'm the new owner." This time the words landed with a clean, literal truth. They were not a taunt nor a joke. They were an assertion of presence, a claim that had been made possible by a legal thread and the willingness of a company to treat a handful of forgotten paperwork as more than a curiosity. There were journalists at the event who would sketch the moment into tidy prose, and executives who would calculate the PR value. There were, too, people who would scoff. Richard expected the sneers, the op-eds that reduce human stories to narratives for and against corporate virtue.
But the thing that struck him in the room that day was not the cameras nor the spreadsheets. It was the hum of small acts of courage. An intern signing up to teach Noah on weekends, a procurement manager who volunteered to source fair trade coffee for the cafeteria so the proceeds could be split with a community fund, a security guard who offered to help paint a mural under the bridge. The change did not arrive like dawn. It arrived like the slow shift in seasons. Rosa's cooking became a weekly ritual that doubled as a job. She hired neighborhood women to help her on preparation days. The company hired a part-time outreach coordinator from the community center to manage the stipend program. Sylvia's spreadsheets turned into stories. A young man who had been homeless learned how to operate a commercial stove and now had a part-time contract. A single mother found work-reliant childcare because the company had shifted a small budget to subsidize after-school care. No one pretended that these moves would end structural poverty, but the measures made a path wider and steadier for several people.
Mark, who had once whispered about margins at the coffee machine, came to a place where he could speak about value without flippant numbers. At a board meeting, one that had once pivoted on net present value, he talked about turnover declines and team morale, and then, unexpectedly, he told a story about a child who had taught him how to fold a paper napkin into the shape of a crown. His tone was not performative. It was the softening of a man who had seen his own world reframed. The pilot's success made room for harder questions. There were moments of friction, employees who resented the attention as favoritism, neighbors who worried about gentrification, a small shareholder who wrote a sharp letter about mission drift. The company found itself in the old place where every change invites scrutiny. Richard took to answering with transparency, audits of the stipend fund, quarterly reports on program outcomes, and open forums where neighbors could speak directly to leadership. The business had been built on transactions. It was learning to respond to accountability. And there were intimacies that did not make it to the minutes. Richard would walk across the city at odd hours and sit beside Rosa as the pot simmered. He learned to shape dough beneath his fingers in a way that felt less like a task and more like prayer. Noah taught him the games of the underpass children and the names of birds in a language Richard had not known he wanted to learn. On Saturday mornings, he would sit by a window with a picture book and listen to Noah practice words he had not had enough time for before. Months blurred into the patient architecture of habit. The underpass grew a small mural painted by company volunteers and neighborhood children alike, swirls of bright cobalt and wheat, and a small painted tin with the faint letters HALE.
The mural was not a monument to one man's guilt. It was a public promise stitched in color. Then one rainy evening, an envelope arrived in Richard's office that would close the circle on the story in a way he had not foreseen. It was from the county archive, a packet of letters found in a ledger box that an archivist had been cleaning. There was a letter from Thomas Hale, written in the careful slant of an older era. It was folded with the kind of economy letters used to have, when paper was a thing to ration rather than to burn. In the letter, Thomas spoke of a small bakery across the river and of a woman named Rosa, whose hands had proved skillful in the chaos of floods. He wrote his belief that business was not simply about profit, but about the health of the towns that fed it. The letter was not legally dispositive. It did not create instruments of ownership. It was, however, a moral articulation, a note of how one man thought business ought to treat people who had kept a neighborhood fed. For Richard, the letter read like an inventory of forgiveness. He placed the faded sheet on his desk and felt the unusual sensation of legacy pressing toward him, not as a weight, but as a request. He could have cataloged the letter and filed it away like a relic. He could have used it as a PR artifact. Instead, he framed it behind glass in the cafeteria near Rosa's station, not as an object of spectacle, but as a reminder that decisions made in one generation echo into the lives of others. The legal finalization came quietly. The trust agreement was signed at a small table in a law office, Sylvia and Rosa and a company representative in attendance. Noah sat between Rosa and Mrs. Daniels and watched as the pen moved. He had been given the legal rights of authorship to a small set of shares, held in trust for him until he reached adulthood. The company would administer the funds and commit to a governance model developed with community stakeholders. When the lawyer closed the folder, Noah gave a little exhale and said, as if announcing an important truth he had been practicing, "Sir, I'm the new owner." People laughed then, not unkindly, but the laughter held something else, the release of disbelief into recognition. The phrase, which had begun as a child's playful claim, had folded into a reality shaped by rusted paper and deliberate choices. Richard thought of that first day in the parking lot, the way he had laughed when the boy declared ownership like some small trespass on his executive life. He had laughed then because the claim felt like nothing compared to the weight of his responsibilities. He did not laugh now. He felt instead like someone given a second chance to do something small and true. The courtroom of public opinion had its say, as it always does. Columns praised the company for restorative action. Others discounted the move as a strategic PR pivot. Employees debated in Slack channels and hallway conversations.
But in the small arithmetic of one woman's pantry and one child's school bag, and a dozen people who had gained reliable work, the calculations were simpler and truer. Noah's life changed in modest, vital ways. He enrolled in a neighborhood school that had a reading program. He helped younger children with their homework, his voice steady as he sounded out words. On Saturdays, he shadowed Rosa in her kitchen and learned not just recipes, but rhythms, when to turn up the heat and when to let dough rest. Rosa, for her part, purchased a tiny room above a laundromat nearby, a place with a window that let in morning
She slept on a mattress that was not full of lumps and had a shelf for her limited collection of salt shakers and a small radio. She had turned down interviews that would have turned her life into a picket fence of narrative. She wanted the work to be work, not a performance of gratitude. The company's culture bent around these small truths. The student-mentor pairs met weekly. The mentors practiced patience as a craft. Human resources learned that dignity is not about one-time awards, but about steady contracts and predictable pay. Executives learned to measure their day not just in yields, but in whether or not children in the neighborhood had a library book at home. Richard kept a corner of his life for the more private reckonings. He spoke to his sister about their father and the bakery, and the ways memory can be both tender and evasive. He sat alone with the scrapbook of his family and admitted, finally, that his father had not been merely a businessman. He had been a man who left boxes and ledgers and gaps that other people had tried to live in. The admission was not an absolution, it was a clearing. There were small rewards that had nothing to do with shares or stipends. One morning, Noah ran into the cafeteria carrying a drawing he had made, a row of small houses and a tin lunchbox with the letters H-A-L-E, the paint bright and naive. He thrust it across the counter to Rosa, who laughed like someone who had been given back the taste of lemon. Richard watched them and felt in a way that had little to do with numbers that some things were owned by the living alone. Mornings, the right to a full stomach, the chance to learn words. On the day the mural was unveiled beneath the underpass, the rain held off as if it had been asked politely. A crowd gathered, employees, neighbors, children with paint on their elbows. A small plaque read simply, "Hale and Neighbors." No one pretended it solved anything. No one claimed it was more than a marker of intent. A ribbon was cut and a pot of Rosa stew was ladled into bowls. People ate standing up, the concrete around them washed in the mural's colors. A reporter asked Richard later, on the steps of the underpass, whether he felt redeemed. He considered the question the way one considers a complex recipe. Some things are flavors that never fully simmer down.
I don't think of it as redemption, he said slowly. I think of it as the permission to make amends where I can. There are things I wish I'd noticed sooner, but we can't live in regret. We can act now. If the story had a single moral, it might be that acknowledgement matters more than spectacle. The company did not become a utopia. Shares did not make people carefree, but a child who once hid beneath a tarp learned that his name had been kept somewhere others could find it, and a woman who had labored in private kitchens learned that her labor could give her a paycheck and a schedule, and, with it, a shape for hope. Months later, at a small gathering in the office cafeteria, an intern asked Noah what it felt like to be an owner. He had been given a small card, the official certificate of his trust membership, and he kept it in a thin wallet. Noah looked up, the child who had once traded half a pastry for company, now an advocate for reading circles, and said, "It means I have someone who listens when I say I need a book. It means my grandma can sleep without worrying. It means my friends can come for dinner and not be told to leave at midnight." He grinned, then added, with the kind of wisdom that often arrives early in those who have had to account for their day, "And it means I still have to work for it. Ownership is not a thing you get and stop. It's a thing you keep by doing." Richard felt something uncoil in him, like the release of a long-held animal at last set free. The paper in his drawer had left the darkness and became a story. The story had become a plan. The plan had turned into an ongoing responsibility. He found he liked being owned in some small way, owned by his promises, by a boy who insisted on his presence, by a woman who demanded dignity instead of pity. There were quieter proofs. A small sampler in the company cafeteria featured Rosa's pastries, and the printed recipe credited her. An employee satisfaction survey showed a slight yet consistent rise in responses that spoke to meaningful work. A neighborhood bus route adjusted its timing to make it easier for workers to travel to shifts. People who had once been counted as margins were now participants in the ledger of the city. One evening, Richard walked under the bridge and lingered at the mural. He noticed a group of children painting the edge where the bright cobalt met the concrete, every stroke a deliberate insistence that color could change the feel of a place. He thought of that first laugh he had shared with Noah in the parking lot, the reflexive dismissal of a child's claim. He thought of how wrong laughter can be and how it can be repaired. Noah ran up and thrust a paper into his hands, a page torn from a notebook on which he had written in uneven letters, "Sir, I'm the new owner," and then under it, smaller, "of mornings." "It sounded better in my head," he confessed, then grinned. "It sounds perfect now," Richard said. He believed it.
Ownership had shifted from title to practice. The boy had not been claiming the black SUV or the corner office. He had been claiming belonging, his right to be named and counted in the city's ledger. The company had not been forced to give away fortunes. It had been invited to recognize an old obligation and to convert it into structures that reinforced dignity. At a small annual meeting, Richard presented an update to the board. He read aloud an excerpt from the letter Thomas Hale had written years before about business as a social act. He spoke of metrics, but also of breakfasts shared in the cafeteria, of a reading program that had lifted test scores in a neighborhood school, of the mural that had brought children across the river to help paint. He did not expect unanimous approval. He expected skepticism and hard questions. He received both, but he also received something else, a modest clapping from a board member who, on seeing a picture of a child turning the pages of a book under a lamp, felt the arithmetic of human life change its decimal place. When the meeting ended, Mark caught him in the hallway. The man who had once been a fortress of pragmatism looked for a moment like someone who had learned a new language. "You changed something here," Mark said quietly. "Not all of it, not overnight, but something. Thank you." Richard thought of the way Mark had once admonished him to avoid distractions. He found himself smiling in a way that was not defensive. "Thank you for staying," he said. There would be critics, of course. There would be conservative letters and cautious columns. There would be times when the stipend fund needed replenishing, or when a program misstepped. They would all require tending, and the company had learned in the first hard months that tending is the slow work of institutions. On a Sunday morning, months after the trust was signed, Richard visited the small room Rosa had rented. Sunlight spilled across a thin mattress. A pot on the windowsill steamed faintly. There was a sense in the room of ordinary abundance, a shelf with a few spices, a towel folded like a book, a chair that had seen summers. Noah was at a small table, drawing maps and labeling them in careful letters. He had a book open beside him and a pencil behind his ear. Rosa looked up as if she had been prepared for his arrival, as only people who have always been prepared can be. She slid a plate toward him, simple bread and a stew, and his throat closed at the taste. It was home, thick and honest. They spoke about jars and paint and how to move the mural's edges more boldly. They spoke about schedules in school and the fact that Rosa had purchased a small black and white television, not because she wanted noise, but because she liked to see the weather forecast without waiting for the morning. Before he left, Noah tugged at his sleeve and pulled him to the window. Outside, the city was a moving collage. Buses, joggers, a woman walking a dog, a child swinging a bat at a ball. Noah pointed at the street. "Do you know," he said, "that sometimes I look at the people in cars and think they are in a fishbowl, but then I remember someone might be looking back." Richard looked at the traffic and thought of his own life like a fishbowl, once gleaming and now a little scratched and full of different inhabitants than he'd imagined. He had started as the man who could buy whole streets, and it ended somewhere else, at the place where being a neighbor mattered more than being a purchaser. As he walked back toward his car, he took the tin lunchbox from his jacket pocket and set it on the hood for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a small stack of photographs, some of Rosa's neighborhood, some of the mural, one of a young Thomas Hale standing beside a storefront. Noah had slipped them in, a private archive that made the past and present full together with the ease of a familiar hymn. He set the tin back in his pocket, and as the city's lights winked on, heard in his head a voice that would not leave him. It was not the voice of investors or shareholders. It was the voice of the boy who had interrupted his stride with a claim that at first seemed absurd, and then increasingly urgent. "Sir, I'm the new owner." The sentence had been a joke. It had been a right. It had been a request. It had become, through the patient work of small decisions, an opening for something sustained. On the drive home, he thought of the word owner, and of ownership as a verb, a way of living that requires constancy and attention. It was not about titles or trophies. It was about being present and accountable. He parked his car and for a long while sat inside it,
hands resting on the steering wheel. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, and beneath it, a lighter, less tenable thing, the knowledge that no one is ever fully absolved by a single act of repair. There would be more ledger entries, more decisions, some missteps, but there would also be dinners and reading groups, and a mural that invited children to dream in color. At home that evening, he opened his desk drawer and for the last time placed the tin lunchbox on his kitchen table. It looked smaller in the light of his apartment. Noah's handwriting on a scrap of paper had been folded into it and now lay flat like a brief confession. Richard took a breath and thought of the number of people who cross our paths and alter quietly the axis of our lives. He thought how easy it is to pass by, to assume safety, to misread the simple logic of another life. He thought of the child who offered half a fried pastry and of the woman who had cooked for a generation. Two acts that stitched together rewrote the ledger. Before he turned off his lamp, he picked up the scrap Noah had pressed into his palm on the day they had first met. The single word, Hale.
He laid it beneath the tin, as if to honor the small fact that had started the chain. Outside, the city continued to move in its precise, stubborn way. Inside, a family ate dinner with plates that had been purchased, in part, because a company had chosen to acknowledge a forgotten paper and a woman had chosen dignity over spectacle. In the end, the title that had once sounded like a child's audacity, "Sir, I'm the new owner," made sense in a way no one had predicted. The boy was not claiming a car or a company. He was claiming belonging. He had named himself in the ledger. The company, imperfect and practical, had recognized him. The rest was slow work: trust agreements, cafeteria menus, reading circles, mural painting. And the city, which is made of many lives rubbing together, shifted a little. People who had once been invisible learned to expect that someone might notice them. A man who had traded relationships for revenue relearned how to knead dough. A child who lived under a tarp learned to call himself something other than invisible. If you ever find yourself in the tilt between hurry and kindness, Richard liked to think, look under the car. Not only for scraps and tin, but for the small claims of people who would, if named, become the true owners of our mornings. Share what you can and listen for the quiet proclamations that begin with a child's laugh. If you hear for a second, "Sir, I'm the new owner," do not laugh it off. It might be, after all, an invitation.